So the point of a while loop, or any conditional loop, is that ahead of time you don't know how many times the action is going to be repeated, but a lot of times it's actually useful to know that. So what we can do is we can count ourselves how many times the action is repeated. So we have some kind of a running count variable that we initialize to 0. And in this case, what I'm going to do is to ask the user for positive numbers, and I'm going to count how many positive numbers the user actually enters. So we prompt the user for a positive number and store that in a variable num, and we say while num is greater than or equal to 0, so while it's positive, then we're going to execute the action which adds 1 to the counter, so the first time count would now be 1, and then prompts the user again for a positive number, again storing the result in the variable num. So we go back up to the condition on the top of the while loop. While this number is positive, then we'll add 1 to the running count and prompt the user again. If that's also positive, then we'll add 1 to the count and prompt the user again. So we keep doing this. We keep adding 1 to our count and prompting the user for another positive number until the user finally enters a number that is negative. That will get us out of the loop, and then we'll print you entered and the value of count positive numbers. So if the very first time we prompt the user for a positive number and the value of num is already negative, then the value of count here would be 0. Now here's a variation. What if we actually wanted to store all of the positive numbers that the user enters? So again, we're going to start by prompting the user for a positive number and storing it in a variable num. Now we're going to have a vector, and we'll start it out at the empty vector. So while the user is entering positive numbers, we're going to take the vector, what's already in vec, and extend it by concatenating the value of the variable num and storing that back in vec. So we're just taking each positive number and adding it to the end of the vector and then prompting the user again for a positive number. So again, we keep executing the action of the loop as long as the user is typing in positive numbers. We're just concatenating each number to our vector and prompting for another number. No need for a count here because we can figure out how many positive numbers the user entered by the length of the vector. So once we get out of the loop, when the user types in a negative number, we print you entered and then the length of the vector positive number. So now we actually have all of the positive numbers stored in the vector, and the length of vec will tell us how many there are. And again, if the user typed in a negative number up here when we first prompted, then the vector would still be empty, and so the length of vec would be 0. So we'd be printing you entered 0 positive numbers. So remember that extending a vector is very inefficient. So if we don't need to store the numbers, then we wouldn't do this. Sometimes with a while loop, if you have no idea how many times the action is going to be executed, then you have no choice but to start with an empty vector and keep extending it. So if you have any idea how long the vector is going to be, it's better to pre-allocate. But sometimes, again, in a while loop, you don't have any choice.